the summer of 2007, a woman walked into a photocopy shop in Woking in Surrey and asked the staff to copy a stack of technical documents and put them onto a disc. It was an entirely ordinary request. Woking is a commuter town. The shop copied things for people all day, except one of the employees looked at the pages while they were feeding through the machine and noticed something. The documents were covered in Ferrari logos, and this shop happened to be in the town that is home to McLaren. That employee contacted Ferrari, and what unfolded from that single moment became the largest cheating scandal in the history of Formula One, ended with a $100 million fine, destroyed several careers, and produced a championship decided by a single point, in the most poisonous atmosphere the sport has ever generated. This is the story of Spygate. And the strangest thing about it, the thing that makes it more interesting than a simple case of industrial theft, is that nobody has ever been able to agree on how much the stolen information was actually worth. And to understand why it detonated the way it did, you have to know what 2007 was before any of this happened, because it was already one of the strangest seasons in the sport's history. Michael Schumacher had retired. Ferrari, who had dominated the early part of the decade, were rebuilding around Kimi Räikkönen, who had arrived from McLaren. McLaren had signed Fernando Alonso, who had just taken 2 championships off Schumacher with Renault, and was, at that moment, the best driver in the world by general agreement. And into that, McLaren promoted a rookie almost nobody outside the paddock had heard of. So the season began as a story about a generational handover, with the sport's biggest team assembling what looked like the strongest driver lineup on the grid, against a Ferrari that had lost its defining figure. That's the context. A championship everybody expected to be close, between 2 organisations who genuinely disliked each other, with the most valuable driver market movement in years having just taken place between them, which meant that when the espionage case landed, it did not land in a calm season. It landed in the middle of a title fight between the 2 teams involved, with a driver who had just moved from one to the other, and a rookie outperforming a double world champion inside the accused team. Every single one of those elements ended up mattering. Start with the 2 men at the centre, because neither of them is who you'd expect. Nigel Stepney was a Ferrari man, not a junior engineer, not a peripheral figure. He had been at Maranello for years. He was a senior member of the team, and he had been part of the crew during the most dominant period in the team's modern history, working closely with the group around Michael Schumacher and Ross Brawn and Jean Todt that had turned Ferrari into an unstoppable machine. And by 2007, he was unhappy. The reason matters. That golden group had begun to break up. Schumacher had retired at the end of 2006. Brawn had taken a sabbatical. There was a restructuring, and in that restructuring, Stepney felt he had been passed over for the role he wanted and effectively sidelined into a position he didn't respect. So here is a long-serving, senior man with enormous institutional knowledge who feels he has been demoted by an organisation he gave years to. That is, historically, the profile of almost every person who has ever leaked anything, anywhere. On the other side is Mike Collin, McLaren's chief designer, also senior, also extremely well regarded, and crucially, someone who knew Stepney, because Formula One is a very small world where the same few hundred technical people circulate between a handful of teams over decades. The 2 men were in contact, and at some point in early 2007, Stepney passed Collin a substantial package of Ferrari technical information. The figure usually reported is around 780 pages. Now, what was actually in it is the part everyone gets wrong, because people imagine blueprints of a car, as though McLaren could simply build a Ferrari. It wasn't that. Or rather, it wasn't only that. The material was a broad technical dossier covering how Ferrari did things, weight distribution philosophy, details of their braking systems, their tyre gas configuration, aerodynamic details, their flexible rear wing arrangement, testing procedures, and a range of information about how the team operated, which is, in some ways, more valuable than a drawing of a part, because a drawing tells you what a rival built, and a dossier tells you how they think. And it's worth understanding why that kind of information is so valuable in this particular sport, because it isn't obvious from outside. In most industries, knowing a competitor's specification tells you what they sell. In Formula One, everybody already knows roughly what everybody else's car looks like. The cars run in public, 40 times a weekend, in front of dozens of cameras and hundreds of rival engineers with binoculars and long lenses. Teams photograph each other's flaws and diffusers constantly and openly. That is normal and accepted. What you cannot see from a photograph is why. You can see that a rival has a particular rear wing. You cannot see what load it generates, at what speed it starts to flex, how much drag it costs them, or what they had to give up elsewhere to run it. You can see the shape of a brake duct. You cannot see the temperatures it's managing. So the entire competitive game is teams looking at each other's answers and trying to reverse engineer the reasoning. Every team runs a department doing exactly that, legally, from public images, which means a document that contains the reasoning, the actual numbers, and the philosophy behind the choices skips the single most expensive part of the process, not the manufacturing, the understanding. And in 2007 specifically, there was a reason Ferrari's reasoning was worth more than usual. The sport had just moved to a single tyre supplier, and getting a car to work with those specific tyres was the dominant performance question of the season. Every team was hunting for the same thing, which was the combination of weight distribution and suspension behaviour that put those tyres in their operating window. Ferrari had, by common agreement, solved that better than anyone. So the material wasn't a car, it was the answer to the question the entire grid was asking that year. And then Coughlin's wife took some of it to be copied. There has been a great deal written about why, and the explanation that circulated at the time was that they wanted a digital copy. Whatever the reason, it is one of the most spectacular own goals in the history of corporate espionage. Nearly 800 pages of a competitor's confidential technical documentation walked into a high street shop in the hometown of the team accused of receiving it. Ferrari acted immediately. They confronted Stepney, they pursued legal action, and they took it to the FIA, the sport's governing body. And here's where the story becomes genuinely difficult, and where the arguments started that have never really been settled. McLaren's position was clear and consistent. Yes, our chief designer had this material. He obtained it privately, he was not authorized to do so, we did not know, and crucially, none of it went into our car. It was one rogue employee. The team as an entity did not benefit. And at the first hearing, in July, the FIA's World Motorsport Council essentially accepted the shape of that. McLaren were found to be in breach, but with no evidence that the information had been used, no penalty was applied at that time. That should have been the end of it. It very much was not. Because in the background, something else was happening at McLaren that had nothing to do with Ferrari, and it was about to detonate. McLaren in 2007 had assembled a driver pairing that looked, on paper, like a masterstroke and turned out to be a bomb. Fernando Alonso, double reigning world champion, arriving as the biggest signing in the sport, and alongside him, a rookie called Lewis Hamilton. The expectation, universally, was that Alonso would lead and Hamilton would learn. That is not what happened. Hamilton was immediately, shockingly fast. He was on the podium in his first 9 races. He was leading the championship. And Alonso, who had joined a team he believed would be built around him, found himself in an intra-team fight with a rookie in a squad run by Ron Dennis, who was insisting on treating both drivers equally. The relationship collapsed spectacularly, and it collapsed hardest in Hungary, where Alonso held Hamilton up in the pit lane during qualifying, costing him a final run. The team was penalised. Alonso was penalised. The atmosphere inside McLaren became genuinely toxic. And then Alonso, in the middle of a confrontation with Dennis, indicated that he had emails and text messages relating to the Ferrari material, and that he could take them to the FIA. Dennis, by his own account, told him to go ahead, and then rang the FIA himself. That is the moment the entire thing reopened. Because the new evidence showed that the Ferrari information had not stayed with one man. There had been communication involving test drivers and other personnel. There were messages discussing the material. which meant the defence that it had been confined to a single rogue employee no longer held. So the case went back before the World Motorsport Council in September, and this time the outcome was extraordinary. McLaren were excluded from the 2007 Constructors' Championship. Every point, the entire season, gone. And they were fined $100 million, which was, by a very long way, the largest financial penalty ever imposed in the sport, and remains one of the largest in the history of any sport. But the drivers kept their points. And that decision, more than any other, is what made 2007 the season it became. Because Hamilton and Alonso were still fighting for the drivers' title in a team that had just been thrown out of the Constructors' Championship, forbidden from scoring and financially gutted. And the Drivers' Championship went to the final race in Brazil, with 3 men in contention, and Kimi Räikkönen won it, for Ferrari, by 1 point from both McLaren drivers. Sit with that arrangement of facts for a moment, because it is genuinely remarkable. The team accused of stealing Ferrari's information lost everything. The team that had been stolen from won both titles. And the margin in the Drivers' Championship was a single point over the 2 men who had spent the year tearing each other apart inside the punished team. And it's worth pausing on how strange the $100 million figure actually was, because it wasn't arrived at the way fines normally are. The FIA didn't have a tariff for this. There was no precedent, no schedule of penalties for industrial espionage, because it had never happened at this scale. So the number was constructed, and the reasoning given at the time was that it represented the commercial value McLaren would have earned from the Constructors' Championship they were being excluded from, plus a punitive element on top. In other words, the fine was designed to remove the season's income and then take more. And for context on what that meant, a competitive Formula One team's entire annual operating budget in that era was in the region of a few $100 million. So the penalty was a very large fraction of a full year of running the entire organisation, imposed on top of losing the prize money they'd have received for finishing where they finished. There's a detail there that people miss too. Exclusion from the Constructors' Championship isn't only symbolic. Prize money in Formula One is distributed according to constructors' standings. So McLaren lost the trophy, lost the payout attached to the trophy, and paid a fine calculated with reference to the payout they'd lost. It is genuinely difficult to think of a comparable financial penalty in any sport, and it landed on a team that had, by the FIA's own first hearing, not been shown to have used the material in the car. Now, the question that everybody argues about, and which is the actually interesting part: did the stolen information make McLaren faster? And the honest answer is that nobody has ever demonstrated that it did. The McLaren car of 2007 was already excellent before any of this surfaced. The design was largely fixed long before the documents changed hands. And the engineering argument, made by a lot of technical people at the time and since, is that a Formula One car is a deeply integrated system, and you cannot simply take a rival's solution and bolt it onto a car built around completely different assumptions. Ferrari's weight distribution philosophy is optimized for Ferrari's aerodynamics, and Ferrari's suspension, and Ferrari's tyre behaviour. Copying a number out of context is worse than useless. What information like that genuinely gives you is not a part, it's reassurance and direction. Knowing that your main rival has arrived at a certain answer tells you which of your own avenues are worth pursuing and which to abandon. It saves you time, and in a sport where the entire competition is a development race against a calendar, time is the only currency that matters. So the fairest reading is probably that the material was valuable, but as intelligence rather than as a shortcut. And that's precisely why it was so hard to prove, and why the argument never resolved. But here's the thing that I think gets lost, and it's why the punishment was as severe as it was. The FIA's problem was never really about lap time. It was about the fact that a team could not be permitted to hold a rival's confidential technical library at all, regardless of whether they used it, because the entire competitive structure of the sport depends on teams developing independently. If holding stolen documents carries no penalty when use can't be proven, then the rational move for every team is to acquire everything they can and simply never write down that they looked at it. The penalty wasn't for the advantage. It was to make the possession itself unthinkable. There's also a background element that you cannot really understand this case without, which is the relationship between McLaren and the FIA leadership at the time. Ron Dennis and Max Mosley, who was FIA president, had a long and famously difficult history. They had clashed repeatedly over the years, on regulations, on governance, on the balance of power between the teams and the governing body. Dennis had been a leading figure in the team's attempts to assert themselves against the FIA, and there was genuine personal animosity in both directions that was well known in the paddock and reported at the time. Now, that does not make McLaren innocent. The documents existed, the communication existed, and by the second hearing, there was material showing the information had circulated further than one man. But it does help explain the shape of the outcome, and particularly the contrast with what happened the following year, when a comparable case involving a different team produced no penalty at all. The lesson a lot of people in the paddock took from it was not that espionage carries a $100 million price. It was that the price depends enormously on who you are and who is sitting in judgment. Now the human cost, because it's substantial, and it's the part that usually gets a sentence and deserves more. Nigel Stepney and Mike Coughlin both faced legal proceedings. Both were finished in Formula One in the roles they'd held. Coughlin eventually returned to the sport years later in a different capacity. Stepney never really did, and he died in a road accident in 2014. Ron Dennis, who had built McLaren into one of the two most successful organizations in the sport's history, spent the rest of his career with this attached to his name, and his relationship with the FIA leadership of the time never recovered. Alonso left McLaren at the end of the season, after 1 year of a multi-year deal, in a departure that was formally by mutual agreement and was obviously nothing of the sort. He went back to Renault. He would not win another championship. Hamilton stayed, lost the 2007 title by a point, and won it the following year. And it's worth following what happened to the two teams afterwards, because the trajectories are almost the opposite of what the verdict suggests. Ferrari, the wronged party, won both championships in 2007 and the constructors' title again in 2008. And then they entered a long decline. They would not win another drivers' championship for well over a decade, and by the time this story gets retold, they had become the team that keeps not quite winning. McLaren, having lost a season and paid the largest fine in sporting history, won the drivers' championship the following year with Hamilton. The organisation absorbed the blow, and the driver at the centre of it went on to become one of the most successful in the sport's history. So the sanction, enormous as it was, did not actually determine much of anything about what followed, which is a slightly uncomfortable thought because it suggests the penalty functioned mainly as a statement rather than as a corrective. The one person it genuinely broke was Ron Dennis, and even that took time. He remained at McLaren for years afterward, but the affair attached itself permanently to his reputation, and it removed him from the sport's inner politics in a way he never recovered. And here's the postscript that makes the whole thing feel like a farce, and which people frequently forget. The following year, in 2008, a different case emerged involving Renault, in which it was found that a former McLaren employee had taken McLaren technical information with him to Renault. The World Motorsport Council found Renault in breach. They were given no penalty, which tells you, more clearly than anything else, that the $100 million was never really a tariff for a specific offence. It was a judgment about a specific team, in a specific year, in the middle of a specific set of relationships between people who did not like each other. And there's a lasting consequence that goes well beyond one season, which is what it did to how teams handle people. Formula One has always run on movement. Engineers change teams constantly. That's how ideas spread, and it's been true since the sport began. A designer leaves one team for another and inevitably takes their experience with them, because you cannot unknow how you solved a problem. That was always understood to be legitimate. What you carry in your head is yours. What you carry in a folder is not. Spygate made everyone extremely nervous about where that line sits, and the response was structural. Gardening leave periods got longer, so that a departing engineer's knowledge would be out of date before they arrived anywhere. Contracts got tighter. Data access inside teams got compartmentalized, so that fewer people could see the complete picture of a car. document control became a serious internal function rather than an afterthought. And there's a cultural residue too. Every time a team makes an unexpected leap forward now, there is a reflexive suspicion in the paddock about where it came from, and accusations of one form or another surface with some regularity. That reflex didn't exist in the same way before 2007. The single biggest legacy of the whole affair isn't the fine. It's that the sport became permanently suspicious of itself. So what is Spygate actually about? It's usually filed as a cheating story, and it isn't really. Nobody proved a car went faster. What actually happened is that a disgruntled senior employee at one team handed a package to a friend at another, and the second team then failed to handle it correctly. And then a driver at war with his own employer used it as leverage. And a governing body with its own history with that team imposed the largest fine in sporting history. It's a story about grievance and about what happens when private frustrations inside enormous organizations collide. And it started because somebody took 800 pages to a copy shop in the wrong town.